So my name's Tempe. I'm one of the careers consultants at ANU. What I wanted to talk about today is about values, skills and interests and how important they are to making some decisions around the types of careers and jobs that you might want to go to. So what we're going to cover today is just understanding why that's important and how you can go about identifying your values, skills and interests, because they really inform the decisions you make about your career and the types of jobs that you'll go into and how that helps you with exploring options. I'm really happy to take questions as we go. So Sky, who's helping me today, will field those questions if you want to put those into the chat. Or if you're comfortable just speaking up, that's fine as well. Just speak up and just ask your question as we go. So we'll work through quite a lot of slides and content, but as I said, I'm really happy to answer questions as we go. So why do we need to know values, skills and interests? What's that sort of got to do with careers? What values are really important to understand is they really drive your decisions around the types of sectors or organisations that you want to work in. So having an alignment of your values and what's important to you in a career with the organisation that you're working with is really important. And I guess a personal example for me was I worked in consulting for 5 years and I really enjoyed the work that I did, but I realised that actually my values, it wasn't about the company I worked for. My values in working in a profit generating sort of organisation were a bit of a mismatch because I'm not really that excited by profit graphs. And I guess that's how I sort of really realised that how important values are in making decisions about the types of organisations or the type of work that you like to do. So it's really important to identify your values, and it's not something we just sit and do on a Saturday afternoon. Oh, let's sit down and think about our values. So it's through people, you know, like careers consultants and other people giving you some tools to help you think about, well, what is important to you in a job and in an organisation. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. The second thing is interests. So interests are really important for selecting work that will be interesting for you, because at the end of the day, we want to go to work and actually be interested in what we're doing. So knowing where our interests lie and what's important around that sort of stuff is really important again. And once again, we don't sit and talk about that and think about that, you know, generally. So having some tools to help you do that is really important as well. And last but not least is skills. So not necessarily just skills that that you have and that you're good at, but also the skills that you like to use, because that's really important. Sometimes people can be good at things, but they don't necessarily want to do those in their job on a daily basis. So it's thinking about, well, out of the skills that I have or the skills that I want to attain, what are the ones I really like to use? So that's why we focus on this. So the next slide just talks a bit about a model that we use, I guess, and there'll be similar models around all different universities and around what are the steps in thinking about your career and the sort of career choices you're going to make. And so what we're focused on today is the self-awareness sort of part. You know, it's all very well to go and look at organisations and apply for jobs, but if you haven't really reflected and thought about, well, what are my skills? What are my personal attributes? So how would people describe me? Would I be described as, you know, a patient person, a tolerant person, someone who's organised? So those attributes are really important as well. And what are you passionate about? And what types of things are important to you in a job? So that's what we're going to really focus on today. Then that really helps you start to explore options. So what are the occupations and industries that you're interested in? You know, what knowledge and skills and attributes and experience are important? And, you know, do you need to do further study, or do you need further experience to actually match with the sort of options you're looking at? And then the next stage is really about, you know, reviewing and making choices. So setting some career goals, thinking about, well, what are those sorts of roles that interest me? Deciding on the best fit between you and those employment sort of options. And then the really, you know, huge part of it is taking action. So you've made those decisions. So That's about attending workshops like this, or getting advice on your applications or your interviews, or finding out more about how organisations recruit, developing networks in your field. So applying for jobs is important, but you also need to have some networks in the field that you're interested in. And identifying where a job's advertised that you're interested in, and how do you go about applying. And then practicing your interview skills and preparing for assessment centres if that's part of the recruitment process. So that's what we often find is students go straight into that, and they haven't really done that self-analysis to really know where to target their job search. And that's why we're really keen for people to reflect on these sort of things. And then obviously you're gaining experience, you know, so you're continuing to engage in work experience or volunteering or extracurricular sort of activities. And you're focusing on, you know, the skills that are gained through that experience, and then revising your sort of career plan or goals. Now that's a nice, neat circle. And as we know, life doesn't usually go in a nice, neat circle as we're experiencing at the moment. So sometimes you can jump between these stages, but this is just a bit of a sense of, you know, the sorts of things that are involved in thinking about your career. So as I mentioned before, you know, what we find is a lot of students go straight to the two final steps in this framework that we use, which is about finding and securing work, which obviously is what, you know, you're going to do when you graduate, and also then creating and maintaining work, which is about, you know, continuing to work throughout your career, continuing to be employable. But what we find is not a lot of people really focus on the understanding yourself and understanding what's happening in the labour market. So we're not going to really talk about the labour market today, but yeah, understanding yourself. And so then when they go and do their job search, it's quite an unfocused sort of approach. It's like, well, I just applied for anything, or I saw these jobs advertised, or I saw these graduate programs, so I just put in for them. And they haven't really thought through, well, what sort of organisations interest them? You know, where do their interests lie and their skills lie in relation to the different organisations? So what do employers look for? Because, you know, we can talk about all this stuff, but, you know, what are employers really looking for? And, you know, in a really broad sense, they're looking for people with all sorts of degrees. They're looking for people with a combination of casual work and volunteering. Because then what that gives you is the employability skills, or the skills that they're looking for, which are things like teamwork and problem solving and analytical skills, which you've also got from your study. But the advantage of casual work and volunteering is that you get to apply those skills, you know, in a practical sort of way. So really, employers are not necessarily focused on what you study, which is probably not what you want to hear as you're really deep in your study, but they're not necessarily focused on what you study unless it's a really specialised degree and, you know, you're studying engineering and you're going to be an engineer, or you're studying medicine. But they're focused on the combination of things that you do as well as your study. So that's important to sort of think about, you know, as you're getting closer to graduating and thinking about, you know, applying for jobs, trying to think about it from the employer's point of view is really important. So how do we go about developing self-awareness? So it's really about identifying what motivates you. You know, how do you define success? What success means to me versus you versus Sky that's sitting in with us can be really different. So it's really important to sort of think about as you're going through, you know, applying for jobs, and then as you're in your, you know, graduate jobs, thinking about, well, is this, you know, meeting what I need, what I want? Is this making me happy, or do I need to think about sort of moving on? And our goal, I guess, is really to prepare students to make those decisions throughout their career and know how to go about changing jobs or moving jobs and that sort of thing. So that's what the self-awareness is all about, is about thinking about, well, what's important to you, what motivates you, what's going to get you up out of bed, off to work, that's going to keep you engaged, because that's what, you know, ultimately we want. We want you in great graduate jobs where you're having a good time and satisfied and enjoying yourself and stimulated. So the three parts that we talk about around, you know, making decisions around careers is the you part, which is what we're focusing on today. But then what that drives is thinking about, well, what are the different sectors? And I'll talk a bit more about that. What are the different industries that you can work in? And then what are the actual job titles? Because that's often a bit of a mystery. You know, if you just went on to the Australian Public Service job site and just looked around, there'd be all these job titles and you'd be going, what do all those job titles mean? So part of what we really encourage students to do is think about all of this sort of stuff before they get to the point of applying, so that you know you've demystified some of those job titles and know what they mean and how they fit with whether you're interested in them and your skills, etc. So the three things we're going to look at are your values, skills, and interests. So what are the differences between values, skills, and interests? Well, interests are more about things that you really like to do. So, you know, you might say something, I really like to, you know, so one of my favourite courses was sociology. So I really like to study sociology. Or I'm really interested in this. So I'm really interested in working with people in workshops, you know, working one-on-one with people. So interests sort of focus on that sort of language. Skills are more things that you've been trained in. You've often attended a training course to receive those sort of those skills, or you might have learnt it on the job from someone else, or you might have learnt it in a volunteering opportunity. So it's about, I can do this, or I'm good at this, or I do well in this. And then your values are, I guess, more fundamental, foundational things about what's important to you. So here's an example of a few values. So it could be around, it's really important for me to do work that yields results. So that would be classified as sort of achievement. Or it could be that, you know, you want to really contribute to the betterment of the world, and that's about helping society. So what we often find is not all values that you have are met through your jobs. Or your career, but if you can get most of your values met, what often happens is through your other parts of your life, you can meet those, you know, have those values met. So if you don't get the chance, for example, in your job to run training courses, you might go and run training courses in a volunteer capacity. So it's really knowing, you know, what's important for you, because that will really help determine the types of organisations that are a match. So I'm just going to take a pause there and just ask, are there any questions about what we've talked about so far? If not, that's fine. I'll keep moving on, but feel free to ask any questions as we go. Okay. So there's a number of different ways that you can identify values. What you'll often see is checklists where you can actually someone will give you a list of values and they get you to actually identify what are your top sort of 10 values, and then they might get you to really narrow it down to 4 or 5 values if you know, you wouldn't give them up. So if we were in a group situation, and Sky and I have done this together, where we might have these big values cards, and we would actually get students to hand these cards around and find the ones that were really important to them that they didn't want to let go of, and other students would come and try and negotiate with them to get those values. So they're the things that you really hold dear to you, that you really want to have in your career. So there's lots of ways that you can identify your values. There's quite a lot of stuff online. If you want to do it yourself or at your own university, you'd be able to do it. You know, through your careers area. If you're at ANU, you can certainly do it with us. We have a online tool that we get students to do that provides quite a comprehensive report about your values. So I'd really encourage you to think about this if you haven't already. So the next part, so the reason we're talking about values, if we think back to what we talked about first, is that it really helps us determine the types of organisations. And I think this is a really important stage to think about, because as I said, it's quite easy to jump from, I've been studying on now I'm nearly graduating, I better apply for a job. But sometimes we don't even sit back and reflect about, well, what types of organisations do I want to work in? You know, what's going to drive me? And so I'm just going to talk you through the types of, I guess, industries or sectors that exist, and start just as you're sitting there listening, think about, well, where do I think my values might lie, and where, you know, what appeals to me? So the first thing is government, okay, or public service. And I think what we find at ANU sometimes too is that people forget there's 3 levels of government within Australia itself. So you've got Commonwealth government, or often called federal government, or Australian Public Service. Examples are departments like DFAT. So that level of government is specifically focused on policy and national sort of approaches. So if you have a sort of interest in, you know, doing policy work or doing things on a national sort of scale, that could be a level of government that you might be interested in. But what we've also got to remember is there's other levels of government. So there's state and territory government. And then in Canberra and Northern Territory, because we're territories, we have a merge of state and local government together. But in the other states, or in the states, there's, you know, state government. Now they're generally more involved in service delivery. So if you think about all the services that are provided, like Medicare, Centrelink, you know, the hospitals, all of those are all driven by state government. So that might be something that fits more with you if you're more interested in sort of providing a service at that sort of state level. And then local government is more focused on a community. So if you're in a, and I've been a bit biased here because I've put the council where my hometown is, but Snowy Valleys Council, for example, looks after a particular number of communities, a number of towns that fit into that local government area. So what they then do is focus more on a community focus, and there's jobs anywhere from corporate roles to engineering roles, etc. So it's worth just considering that there are different levels of government. And then state authorities and government corporations are a little bit different again, and they often have their own funding and work more like a private sector organisation. Not-for-profit sector is another sector to consider if you're starting to think about your graduate careers. Once again, often a forgotten sector, and this is all your not-for-profit organisations. So all your charity organisations, your peak bodies, and if you're based in Canberra, there's a lot in Canberra, but there's also a lot throughout Australia, and nationally internationally as well. So it's thinking about, well, you know, is that a sector? Now that's going to be more focused on, once again, providing services for the community, not going to be, it's usually funded by government. So it's a different relationship with government that they have, because they're often funded by government and reporting to government. But they, you know, they don't operate like a government organisation. So that's a really good sector to think about if, you know, if that sort of interests you about providing those services. And there's a broad range of organisations in that sector, anywhere from health, education, social welfare, etc., religious organisations. So the next one is private sector, which I guess is a bit harder to really define because you know, it's very broad, but private sector can be basically, you know, profit-making organisations that are generating profit back to its owners or its stakeholders. So it's thinking about, you know, anywhere from engineering firms, telecommunications firms. So I guess the general thing that's in common with them is the fact that it's, you know, profit making and it's more commercial sort of focus. So it's thinking about, what does that sort of thing appeal to you? You know, do you want to work in a sort of private sector organisation where you might be still delivering a service to a community, but there'll be more of a commercial focus? And then near and dear to our hearts, being where we are, academia and higher education roles. So within the higher education sector, obviously there's the academic roles where they do both research, teaching, and have administrative or service responsibilities where they provide, you know, knowledge back to either the community within their college or within their school or within the university, or broader out to the community. So for example, in our University Crawford school, works on public policy, so they have a lot of connections with government departments and, you know, provide advice, you know, with research in that sort of area. So most higher education roles are based at universities, but not necessarily. There are other organisations that are associated with the higher education sector that also exist to support the higher education sector. And there's also what they call professional staff roles within universities or other tertiary institutions. And that's where people like myself and Sky and Frederica sit. And we're so we're not academic staff, but we're professional staff that provide support services, either in our case to students, but other professional staff might be providing more corporate sort of roles like human resources and information technology, etc. So that's often a sector, once again, that students might forget about, but we're really keen for graduates to come and then work, you know, within universities as well. So that's something to consider as well. And lastly, but not leastly, entrepreneurship and startups. So, and I've given a sort of Canberra reference here, but I know it's across all of the state and territories. This is a big sector. So this is startup organisations, or it could be small to medium enterprises, where you might want to either start a new business or you might want to join a smaller business. They're often profit generating, but they can also be social enterprises as well. So it's, you know, that's another sector to think about that can, you know, be a really good option for people, particularly if they want to have that independence and autonomy, and I guess a less hierarchical sort of organisation. So I'll just pause there in case there's any questions before we move on to interests and skills. Very quiet. Okay, all right, I'll move on then. Okay, so the next part of it is really then thinking about jobs. So, you know, we've talked about, okay, so our values really drive our decisions around the types of organisations and sectors we're interested in. But the decisions around the types of jobs that we might apply for, and I've put, you know, in the circle there, you've got, you know, your actual job title, you've got selection criteria, which is basically organisations identifying skills that they're looking for in applicants, the responsibilities, which is usually framed in a position description or duty statement, called different things in different places, and also the work culture. That's all wrapped up in looking at jobs. And this is really decisions around this are driven by your interests and your skills. So let's focus a bit more on that then. So this is just one model, and I can't, you know, it would take the rest of the time if I talked about this, but this is one model that's been around for quite some time around interests. And once again, you can do this, you know, probably with your careers area. We do it here at ANU, but there's an activity around identifying where your interests might lie. And generally what we find is most people will have 2 or 3 areas that that really fit with their sort of personality type. So if you were to use me as an example, I would be more probably social, because I like a workplace where I've got connections with people, and you know, that's really important to me. I don't like to sit and work on my own all the time. So social would be one of mine. Enterprising is another one of mine, because that's about you know, having an innovative sort of approach, almost like running a business yourself, but having that sort of innovation sort of approach. And then the artistic, you know, and that's not necessarily meaning about painting, that you're a good, you know, artist in that sense, but having that sort of creative outlook and thinking outside the box. So what we find is most people have 2 or 3 that really sort of fit with their approaches to things and their personality. And what we'd encourage you to do is, and once again, there's a lot of stuff online about this, is to think about this and go, okay, well, how, you know, if I end up in a workplace, how can I, you know, have these preferences met? And sometimes what you can do is, even if you go into a job that's in a conventional sort of space, you can create opportunities for you to be social or to be realistic. So it's really good to know this sort of stuff about where you fit, because this will drive, you know, some of those decisions around the types of jobs that you're going to apply for. Because I think it would be really hard to just throw yourself into applying for jobs without doing some of this self-analysis and sort of going, well, where do I feel comfortable? Where do my interests lie? Because, you know, you're just not going to get as great outcome without having that thinking process. So then what about
Tempe?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a question that's come through. Is there an organisation that provides a broad range of work experience opportunities?
Okay. So can whoever asked, can you tell me a bit more about what type of organisation you would be thinking about? Like what would you want that organisation, what would they be focused on? What sort of work would they do? If you can feel free to write it into chat if you'd prefer to do that.
We might come back to it, Tempe.
All right, well, let me just make a general comment on it. So what I would say is that one of the ways that you can get that broad range of experiences, there's a few things I'd think of, and feel free to jump in, Sky, if you think of other things too. One of the things I'd say is that when you apply for jobs and you get into an organisation, there's no reason you can't move around organisations once you're in there as well. So you might go in a particular sort of role and it might find it's not for you or you want to move on. Well, then it's much easier often in an organisation to then move around. So that's one option. Another option is graduate programs. So graduate programs are specifically designed to allow that, what you're asking about, different range of experiences, because how graduate programs are set up is exactly that, so that what they do is bring you in as a graduate, and then they would actually give you an opportunity to work across a number of different roles in the organisation for a certain period of time. And jump in here, Sky, but it's usually a year, but it can be 2 years sometimes, depending on the organisation. And that's specifically what they do, is they rotate you around different roles, and that way you get a chance to find out, you know, what sort of is a good match for you, and they also get a bit of an assessment of where they think your skills are well matched. So that's a really good way. The other thing I suggest to do, if you're not at the stage of actually applying, you're not near graduation, is using things like casual work and volunteering to explore some different experiences that you can have, so you can try out a few things and see what sort of fits with you. Did you want to add anything to that, Sky?
No, the graduate programs, they really sort of take you around the whole organisation and show you, what aspects, certain areas do, so you can get a real feel of, what area really interests you. Some of them go for 12 months, some of them are 18 months. I know the New South Wales Public Service Commission, they sort of ask you where your interests lie and try and sort of make your graduate program tailored to you.
Yeah. And I think this is, I think, really key to what we're talking about, because if you can start to identify where your interests lie and being able to then pick the sort of role. So say you didn't get into a graduate program and you were applying directly, because, we want to preface this all with the fact that graduate programs, don't recruit a lot of people that way. So if you're looking at direct entry, as in applying directly for a position, if you've done your sort of thinking about the sorts of things that you think you might be interested in, and you've done a bit of volunteering and tried out a few things, then hopefully the sort of things you're picking will be more of a match to you. But just remember that whatever you decide is not forever, right? If you go into a role and it's not quite for you, labour market and all of that, consideration, there's opportunities to move around. And I mean, I'm sure Sky would have the same story, but my first job was certainly not something I would want to keep doing. But it got me into the door into that organisation, and from that I moved to other roles. And I'm sure you've had a few jobs like that, Sky, where it wasn't quite your cup of tea. So yeah, but happy to talk about that more in detail if with your individual situation, if that's appropriate. Okay, so let's think about skills. So skills are really things that can be learned through training, education, or on the job. So skills are things that you might not have straight away, but you can develop. And it's really important and this is one of the things I think is particularly challenging for students to make this mind shift out of university, out into the working world, is being able to articulate or talk about your skills. And I mean, we often have students come in and say, oh, well, yeah. And I'll say to them, you know, well, what sort of casual work have you been doing? Or, you know, what volunteering? And they say, oh, nothing that's relevant to my graduate job. But the point is, anything that you have been doing is relevant, right? Because you've used skills. So if you've been working in a cafe, and I know that's probably not very possible lately, but you know, you've been working in a cafe, or you've been volunteering for a charity organisation. There's a whole bunch of skills that you've been using in those opportunities, like teamwork skills, problem solving skills, analytical skills. So they're the sort of skills that most employers are looking for. They're not, unless it's a technical sort of role, they're not really looking for, you know, your knowledge of Karl Marx. They're looking for, you know, the skills that you've gained from the sort of opportunities you've had. So it's really, and this I think is probably one of the most challenging things, because being able to identify your skills is actually often quite difficult on your own. You sort of often need someone to draw that out with you, so that you can think about it. And I just wanted to show you an activity that we have that just shows you a way that you can do this. So I'll show you that in a sec, but I just wanted to once again go back to the employer perspective. So what are employers looking for? So you're sort of starting to think about, okay, well, I'm graduating, you know, either soon or in a year or two or something. What are employers looking for? And if you can remember these three things, this really encapsulates it. And Sky would agree with me. We still hear graduate employers say this sort of stuff, right? They say, we want people that have got skills and abilities and knowledge and experience. But having said that, people can gain more of that, right? It's easier to learn that. So if you don't have every single skill that they've listed in the job ad, don't let that put you off, because most of the time when they're advertising jobs, it's like this wish list of things. They want this perfect person that doesn't exist. So don't be put off by that. And also sometimes the language can be confusing, because they're probably using a lot of language that we don't tend to use when we're university students, right? So they are looking for skills and experience, but that's probably one of the negotiable things. The next thing they're looking for is passion and motivation and interest in the role, you know, that you're applying for, but also in their organisation and potentially the industry. So if you haven't done this research into, well, what sort of roles are you interested in and what sort of organisations and industries, it's really hard to fake that, right? And I'm sure Sky would attest to this. I've been in interviews where people try and fake this, and it just doesn't work. You know when people are really interested in something, and you know when they're not. And this is something we hear from graduate employers. They say to us, so, you know, people doing graduate recruitment, they say to us, oh, it looked like people were just applying for anything. You know, it didn't really look like they'd really tailored their application to our organisation. So that's really important. And then the third part is the cultural fit. So they want to know that you're someone that will work in their organisation, fit into their organisation and contribute to their organisation, right? So the way you identify the cultural fit is through thinking about, well, so I'll use me as an example again. So when I worked at Deloitte, I really registered with their culture, because they had, I'm not sure whether they still call them, but they used to call them signals instead of values. And I looked at their signals and I went, yep, I agree with all of those. And one was called Talk Straight, and Sky's probably laughing in the background because that's something I do. But it's really, you know, and I just went, yeah, that's the sort of organisation I want to work in. I love the work they do, but I also really like the way they operate, because, you know, I believe in talking straight and I believe in, you know, a global approach and things like that. So this can be sometimes challenging to find out what their culture is, but a lot more organisations are getting more sophisticated with this, and letting people know, well, this is what we do in our organisation. This is how we approach it. These are the sort of clients we work with. This is the sort of internal initiatives we have. And that gives you a really good clue about the cultural fit, you know, the culture of the organisation and whether you'll fit. But you have to convince them that you're going to be a fit to their organisation. So I might just stop there and see if there's any questions on that sort of skills stuff before I move on and just show you a few more things around skills. Are there any questions, Sky?
No further questions.
No further questions. Okay. All right. So and look, there's a million of these out there. I've just picked one, but this is from a Future of Jobs survey. And this shows you some of the employability skills. So skills that, you know, employers are looking for that will really set you up well in your career. So you can see there's some things that, you know, you guys will have got from your study, let alone anything else. So analytical thinking, critical thinking and analysis, complex problem solving. So, you know, so if you've worked, you know, in a cafe or you've done something like that and, you know, you've had a difficult customer. So I come in and order my really strange coffee, right? You know, you've done complex problem solving because you've worked out how to, you know, make that strange coffee that I drink. So, you know, there's a lot of examples of this sort of stuff from stuff you might have been doing while you're at university, but it's good to sort of read this sort of stuff and to sort of go, well, where are employers thinking? What are the sort of skills they're looking for? How can I make sure while I'm at uni that I can get some chances to use this? And this could be through student societies, you know, organising events on student societies. It could be, you know, volunteering in other capacities. There's a whole range of ways that you can use these skills and practice using them. So just for your benefit, I'll just show you a tool that we've used before, and this is something you could go away and do yourself. So we call this the bubble map. I know, very fancy name. But what you've got here is you're in the middle, and then this is just an example of all the types of things that this person might have done while they're at university. So, you know, they've obviously been doing a degree, they've been the vice president of a student society, you know, they might have created a program for helping sick kids, they've worked in hospitality for 2 years, they've done a one-day door knock appeal, and they've done tennis coaching. And then what we get you to think about is, well, what are the skills involved in that? You know, so if I've done a degree, well, I've got research skills, right? And the research skills I use in my degree, I can then apply to researching jobs and understanding organisation. It's the same skills, you're just using it in a different context. Or I've got teamwork skills from doing my degree because I've had to work on group projects with other students. So that's built my teamwork skills. I've got writing skills because, you know, I've had to write a lot in my degree. Or I've got technical skills, analysis skills. So this sort of doing something like this gets you to really sit down and think about, well, you know, I have done these different things, and I know, you know, at the moment that some of these opportunities are probably being limited because of COVID. But, you know, thinking about, well, you know, when I've done these sort of things, what are the skills that I've been using to do it? Because these are the sort of things that you can then go and talk to employers about, because employers don't talk about, you know, sociology theories and things like that. They talk about marketing skills or relationship building or adaptability. So if you started to read some of the job ads, this is the sort of language you would see. You wouldn't see language about the stuff you're studying, but you'd see language about teamwork and planning and organising. So what you've got to do with an employer is make the link for them. Okay, so I did work in hospitality for a few years, and what that taught me was this, and these are the skills I used to do it. And that's the translation you've got to make for them. You've got to make it as easy as possible for them to look at your resume, look at your job application, hear you talk and go, oh, right, okay. So Skye can actually do all this because she's actually organised a week. So I know she's got good organising skills because, you know, she's talked to me about that. So it's really important to sort of start to do this sort of stuff because the worst case scenario for me is when students don't do any of this sort of stuff, get to the end of their degree and then go, oh, I've got to find a job. I don't know where to look. I don't know, I haven't practiced any of my interview skills. I don't know how to write job applications. It's just way too much pressure because, you know, it's a pressure situation anyway, having to write job applications. But if you haven't sort of thought about all of this stuff and practice writing applications, it's putting a lot of pressure on yourself. So I'd really encourage you not to put yourself into that situation. Okay. So if this is, so that's the skills, what about the interests? Where do they fit in? And this is a very broad approach to it. But if we think about interests, this really helps you identify the sort of roles that would interest you. So when you see some of those job titles out there, you'll be driven towards some roles more than others, right? And so this is a really broad broad sort of idea of the types of roles that exist across those different industries we've talked about. So there's service delivery roles. So that's where you're providing a service. So that could look like, straight dealing with the public in a customer service sort of role, or it could be, still contributing to the service, but not in that direct sort of approach of, at a counter sort of working with someone, but still contributing to service. So some people are more driven to do that because it's about that connection with people on a really tangible basis. Other people might be more interested in policy work. So, to develop a policy, you need to, consult with stakeholders, you need to do some, write and draft the policy, you need to have it, approved. So, generally involves a fair bit of writing, but also a lot of consultation. So some people, would be really attracted to that. And that sometimes is a nice combination of their content knowledge, so if they've been studying environmental studies, they might then, actually work in environmental policy. And to have a policy, you then usually have to have a program to implement that policy. So if you've got a program in, helping people get back to work if they have had an injury, well, then you need to have a program to actually deliver on that. So there's a whole range of jobs in that program sort of space that are across the different sectors, both, public sector, in the not-for-profit sector, etc. So that's, they're the sorts of jobs. Some roles are specifically technical. So, as I mentioned before, you might be studying engineering, then you might go into an engineering role, or you might be studying science and you might, work in a lab. So there are some roles that are technical that would use exactly what you've studied. Other roles are what we would call sort of corporate support sort of roles. And I sort of alluded to those earlier when I was talking about professional staff roles in, in universities. But this exists across all sectors. So there's always marketing and communications roles. There's always human resources roles. There's always information technology roles, governance roles. Within universities, there's research management roles where you can work with academics on helping them with managing their grants and, getting new grants for their research. So there's a whole range of corporate roles that as a graduate you can apply for, unless they've, some of them may have some specific qualifications, but not necessarily. So they're a good group of roles to consider. And the person that asked the question before about, getting a diverse range of experiences, corporate roles are often a good way to get into organisations. So I know of a friend of mine who went on the DFAT graduate program, but she actually joined the corporate stream, because it was less competitive, but also she still had the same opportunities to go and work, overseas on overseas postings, but she was in a support role. So it's worth thinking about that and not just always just focusing on policy roles, but remembering that corporate roles can be, interesting roles in themselves, but also a good way into organisations. And then if you want to move into another role, you can. And then there's, potentially limited at the moment, but generally there are overseas opportunities through overseas postings or other organisations, international development organisations, etc. So it's worth, thinking about that when things get a bit better. And how do you go about understanding job titles? So I mentioned before that, often it's quite confusing because different organisations will use different job titles. So some of the just job sites can be really good for this. So Seek and Indeed, and just starting to scan some of the jobs, because the more that you start to look at jobs and actually delve down into the detail and look at the position description and look at the selection criteria if they have it, or the skills that are listed, you start to get a sense of, well, what does a project officer do? What does a program manager do? And you will then find that there's, a lot of common elements across industries. They just might change the name of the job a bit. Ethical Jobs is a really good site for not-for-profit organisations. So if you're wanting to start to look into that sector, you can just subscribe to that and you'll get notified of jobs across Australia in that sort of area. So, and really good way to just start to scan, well, what are the sorts of jobs that are available. Higher education. Job Outlook is a government site that's got a lot of good information on it. So if you're wanting to see, well, you know, I've been studying Asian and Pacific studies, and I want to have a look at what sort of jobs are happening in that sort of field, or I'm really looking at positions in law, you can actually look at information about what's happening in different fields and what the job prospects are. But you can also do career quizzes on there and things like that, that will really help you start to identify more about jobs and what those jobs involve. They list the general duties of jobs. So once you've got a job title, you can put a job title in there and it will tell you what that job involves, what's the starting salary, what are the job prospects. So that's a really good site to start to be familiar with. And My Future is a bit similar. It has similar sort of information. So I thought it was worth mentioning some of those things, because a lot of this stuff you can start to look at yourself. So really, you know, the career planning steps we've talked about is, you know, the self-awareness, and that's what I wanted to focus on more today. Then, you know, through that, you can then explore some options because you've started to narrow down. So for example, if I have a career planning appointment with someone, what I will do is I'll get them to do what we call motivation at work, which is the values activity. And then we get them to do another questionnaire that tells us their interests, and it gives us an idea of the jobs that are a match. And then what we would do is give them the chance to go and use their research skills to go and research those jobs and find out a bit more about them and see how, you know, how they feel about them, how they match with their values, so that by the time they're getting ready to apply for jobs, which, you know, you've got to give at least a few months, you know, before you graduate sort of time, you know, to apply for them. You can't sort of apply as soon as you graduate. You need to sort of think ahead. Then you've got some clear ideas on the types of roles that you want to apply for and the types of organisation. And that way you can really target your job search and make sure that, you know, you're keeping an eye on the websites for the organisations that interest you. You're watching the APS site if that's what you want, or you're watching ethical jobs, and you're seeing things as they come through. And, you know, if the timing's right, you know, you can be applying for them, knowing that sometimes, you know, jobs can take, you know, a number of months from when you apply to actually starting if you were successful. So, you know, it's important not to leave that sort of too late. So it's, you know, making those choices, taking that action as we talked about, and then just continuing to reflect and review. So whenever you apply for a job, it's really important to try and get feedback about how you've gone. Generally in the interview, they don't often provide feedback on written applications. Sometimes you can get lucky. But, you know, certainly when you've had interviews or you've been through an assessment centre, you should ask for feedback so you can learn what you did really well and what you could do better next time. If you don't do that, it makes it really hard, and it gets quite disconcerting because you don't know what's going on. You don't know whether it's just there's not enough jobs, or, you know, there's just people better than you, or you just, you know, your written applications aren't strong enough. And that's why it's really important for the written applications to show it to your careers people, but also for interviews and assessment centres to actually ask them for feedback so that you can, you know, continue to improve. So that's all I wanted to talk about. Any questions?
Oh, there's a question just about skills.
Yeah.
How do you find how good your skill is, and what is the line between selling yourself and being honest?
Yeah, nice one. Okay, so I might answer the second bit first, just because that's a bit fresher. So the line between you know, selling yourself and being over that, yeah, too much. So I reckon a really good tool for that is to think about it this way. When you're talking about yourself and what skills you've got to offer, the way I think is good to think about it is that all you're doing is providing examples and evidence of what you've done. So for example, if you were in an interview and they asked you a question like, can you tell me about a time when you managed a conflict in the team? When they use that sort of language, you can use an approach called STAR. So I don't know whether used STAR before, but what that means is situation, task, action, result. So let me talk you through an example using the conflict. So the situation might be, you know, whilst I was working as a careers consultant with A New Careers, the task was there was some conflict. I'm just making this up, by the way. There was some conflict between two students that we were dealing with. The action was that I actually talked to each of the students separately. I used my interpersonal skills to talk to them. I used my negotiation skills to understand both viewpoints. Then I actually brought the two people together and actually got them to talk about their different perspectives. And from that, the result, so the R, was that they actually understood where each other was coming from, and we resolved the conflict. So the way to think about when you're talking about yourself, it's not about boasting. It's not about, oh, I'm really great and blah, blah, blah. It's about actually, you know, yes, I do have those skills because here's an example of when I've done it and this is the result. So if you can frame it in examples, it's the most powerful way to do it because you're just providing evidence. Okay. So the first part of the question, Sky, was, can you remind me?
How do you define how good your skill is?
Okay, so if you're doing it in writing, I guess sometimes you're driven by what they've asked for in the job application. So if you're responding to a specific selection criteria, they'll usually have a word like excellent or demonstrated ability. So you would try and use the same language that they've asked for. If you're talking, if you're doing it verbally and you're talking about your skill, you can use those sort of words, but as I guess it's similar, I would say use the example to demonstrate, you know, the level of skill that you've got, because words like excellent and proficient and stuff are just a bit tricky, because what I call excellent might be different to, you know, how Sky would determine excellent. So it's a tricky one. I would always use examples to demonstrate it.